Hello, hello, this is Alex Burkett, and you are listening to the Long Game Podcast. Today I'm chatting with Jay Acunzo. Jay is a powerful voice in the marketing industry, and really he's an evangelist for creativity, bravery, and releasing yourself from the gravitational pull of mediocrity, and instead choosing to ship great work. He worked on content at HubSpot as well as NextView Ventures, and today he's an author of the great book Breaking the Wheel, show host of the Unthinkable podcast, and a brand consultant. In this conversation, we walk through Jay's process for using story and storytelling to transmit ideas and insights and make them stick. Also, why courage and curiosity are crucial traits of creators and marketers, and how he aspires to be the Anthony Bourdain of business storytelling. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Jay Acunzo. I'm excited to do this because I've followed you for a long time. I read your book, Break the Wheel.
Oh, thank you. Oh, wow.
I feel like I've seen you just kind of like on the circuit and all that stuff. So
appreciate that.
I want to start with, this could be an obvious question. I mean, it's on your LinkedIn profile, but I have to ask. You mention on your bio that your biggest ambition and maybe grandest delusion is to be the Anthony Bourdain of business storytelling. So first off, Anthony Bourdain is one of my biggest influences. You know, I grew up in a small town and I feel like he really triggered a desire for me to like look outside of my world and meet people I normally wouldn't, generally approach life, you know, open-minded. And I feel like that was highly inspiring at a young age, but there's a lot about Bourdain that could resonate. So I wonder, what do you mean when you say that? What about Bourdain resonated with you where you put that, you know, on your LinkedIn bio?
Yeah. It is my grandest aspiration / delusion. I really like B2B. I love the world of work. And the content we get about work does not reflect the emotional spectrum that we actually experience in our work. I mean, it's a lot of it is trite and routine, and it's the same stuff rehashed everywhere you go, whether it's a podcast or a newsletter or a blog or social media. And, you know, on the extremes, then you kind of get stuff that just has me totally disillusioned. Like one extreme, you have well-meaning people that are posting vapid nothingness, you know, fortune cookie tweets or, you know, self-actualization quotes on Instagram because they want to be an influencer. And on the other extreme, you have smug-looking bros who just want to talk about making millions and how to do it faster. And, you know, they talk about the same 6 or 7 or 10 brands over and over again in the media. And it's just, that's never been my experience of work. And my experience of work has always really matched my experience of life. Like I used to want to be a sports journalist, not because I like the games, but because I wanted to tell human interest stories, and sports is a microcosm of the overall human experience. Well, work is an even bigger microcosm of that. And we just don't get it reflected back. And here you have Bourdain, who would walk to a new place, sit with a person in their seemingly mundane day to day, which sounds a lot like the world of work to me. And he would go deeper and ask simple questions and get profound answers and really show an interest, really go on a journey to understand something and shift your perspective, and then back away a little bit and give you space to make sense of it. He wouldn't stuff every detail or every moment full of, you know, his 5 key takeaways or exactly what he would prescribe you do with his information. He wanted you to synthesize it. So he had this awesome blend of like voice and nuanced gray area storytelling. I mean, that's where he lived. He did not wrap it up in a nice, neat bow every time. And certainly respect for the audience to give you something different every time, and really not care if you like the last episode. He's on record saying this, you might not like this one because we're going to try something brand new. And he didn't want to give you, you know, the perfect, beautiful soundbite at the very end, or the 5 simple steps to success or understanding based on what you just heard. He respected the audience to synthesize their own meaning. And so as a result, I think you got closer and closer, not only to him as the storyteller, but to the meaning. You know, and I think for me, it starts with profound, nuanced stories told from the seemingly day to day. And then all the other performative or production things that I mentioned kind of rolled up into what amounts to my storytelling hero.
That's awesome you bring that up, because I think storytelling is at the heart of what I loved about Bourdain. But what I found interesting is he always took his own angle in the story, and he's just this punk rocker at heart who I feel like, you know, he was telling the story of a city and its people, and there's so many different ways you can tell that story. So do you live in Boston?
I do, outside of Boston. Yep.
Did you ever see his Boston episode?
I've seen I've seen every episode of his CNN show, and quite a few of his previous shows. So it's very likely. Yeah.
Yeah, so that Boston episode was super inspirational for me. I don't know if I saw it before I had gone to Boston, but I've been to Boston many times since. I used to work at HubSpot. And he started the episode, this is an older one, it's maybe like 10, 15 years ago. He started the episode by saying, Boston's this beautiful city, a port city. It's got this amazing architecture and, classic history and all that stuff. But we're not going to show you any of that stuff. We're going to show you the Boston that I love. And I think he was pretty vulgar in the intro. Like he said, like, if you don't like it, kind of fuck off. Like, actually pulled a quote. He's like, this is about me and my friend Mike trying to have a wicked fucking time in Boston. And if you have a problem with that, you can fuck off over to Samantha Brown. And then he proceeds to just go to Southie back in the heyday and just gets hammered and goes like bar to bar. And it's just this totally different look. But I feel like you end up seeing a different side of Boston than, your typical maybe surface level show. And that's maybe what you were talking about with the divergence between like what is common, what is always talked about, what is trite, and then finding that unique angle that kind of lies underneath, or like only you could tell that story.
Totally. Like asking questions that are not commonly asked, going on a little investigative journey through story, through, just curiosity, all these things. Like he went to some, as the name of the show implied, he went to some unknown parts of the world. But I think the parts unknown that he really reached were right in someone's backyard, right in, it's like, what can be said about a food truck owner? What can be said about a pizza joint? What can be said about Boston that hasn't been said in the movies and in ample TV food shows on TV? He found it.
With right? Storytelling, there's always this back and forth between the audience and the storyteller, though, right? And you mentioned that with regards to these tweets and like the people, the bro marketers and all that stuff. So I assume they're doing that because it resonates to a certain degree, right? It works. It hits some sort of algorithm. People eat that stuff up. I've noticed myself, like when I try to, I'm trying to build some thought leadership on Twitter, like when I pour my heart and soul into something that I feel like is original, it's often crickets. And then, I'll tweet some trite, banal insight about content marketing, something very high level, and it goes semi-viral. So like, I don't know.
Why is that the arbiter? I mean, why is Twitter the arbiter? Why is an algorithm built by an ad? Basically what we're doing is we're creating free ad inventory for a social network. So why is that becoming the arbiter of like what is worthy to share? Like I interviewed Jack Conte on my show, the CEO of Patreon, and he said something profound, which was there's a difference between what will get clicked on and what has value. These are not the same things. We're conflating what gets reach with what is worth producing, what is worth someone's time. And so like Bourdain was not going to play into those waters, right? And he's going to say to you, this is something that I think you need. It might not be what you want. And I think it's incumbent on all of us as creative people, as communicators, whether you're telling stories like he was or writing a blog or you are a marketer, you got to meet people where they're at. Absolutely. But then you have to deliver what they need. Like, I think a lot of, call it content marketing or inbound marketing, whatever you want to call it, it's devolved into pandering. It's devolved into, I'm going to prey on their baser instincts. And that's the smug bro version of it all, right? 99% of people get this thing wrong, and here's how to do it correctly. And, I'm going to vomit bullshit in a thread. That's pandering to people's baser instincts. I'm fearful that I'm getting it wrong, right? Or I don't know any better. And I think eventually people age out of that stuff, or they figure it out, right? The people who have, meaningful things to say go, this is crap, right? They learn better. And so the game becomes for those smug people arbitrage, right? There's always a new thing you got to know, or a new thing you got to be afraid of. Because if there's always a net new thing, those communicators never have to go deep, never have to be good at what they're doing, never have to master the craft. They can always just sort of keep tricking people and keep moving their audience from the previous new thing to the new thing. But for the rest of us, when we're trying to say something meaningful, when we're trying to resonate, when we're trying to spark some kind of change in understanding or in action or behavior in others, we're trying to make things better in some ways. The rest of us, we don't need to pander. We like whatever they're asking, you should be writing it, because when they're going to Google it, they're going to find you. Great. That's a very tiny percent of all the things that person needs to know about is what they already know to ask. What about all the things they don't know to ask? What about all the things they didn't know they needed to hear? So whether you're a product innovator or visionary, or a communicative, content, story, marketer, branding, visionary, like the difference, I think, between a lot of these base level type content or base level type thinkers and the folks worth following are the folks worth following raise their hand. They go, where we're at right now is broken, and I have a vision for what might be better. And I need to give people not what they want, but what they need. And then we have to figure out how close to where they're already at do we need to go to say, listen, this is what you want. I understand that. This is how you're coming at it, but here's all the problems with that. Maybe consider this instead. And now I'm going to make the case for this shift through story, through heuristics, through, data, whatever it is my superpower to show you it's not just how to, it's how to think. It's how to see the world, which then shows up in every how to. But I think a lot of us limit ourselves to it's got to be the tips and tricks and cheats and hacks, and because the gurus seem to do that and they fly on Twitter. That does not need to be the arbiter, and I don't think it should be.
So as a creator, do you gauge audience feedback? Do you take it with a grain of salt? Do you look at who it's resonating with? Or is it more this iconoclastic vision where you just think over the long term, what I'm saying is true to me, therefore the people who are going to resonate with that are going to pick it up over time? Or right. I guess what's your balance?
Yeah, totally. There's a difference between creating things that nobody else sees and you don't care if they see it, which by the way, self-expression is its own reward. I think every creative person needs a private practice. I don't mean you're an independent agent, like a doctor would have a private practice. I mean, it is yours. No stakeholder controls it but you. And so whether that's, for me, it was blogging many, many years, or adding a podcast to that, or switching from blogging to newsletters, or something that hones your taste and skill and confidence and all these things that kind of you need to do that to wade into waters that are slightly deeper than what an employer or a client would allow you to do at the moment in time, like building your body of work in a way you control. We all need that. Those come with certain restrictions. It's actually not about the audience. It's actually not about any kind of quote unquote result other than my own abilities. But for everything else, we do need to see results. And so there's a difference between, I'll say it like this. There's a difference between being a good storyteller and an effective storyteller. So all storytellers speak with some kind of clarity. And I think that's where a good storyteller stops. So a good storyteller would, affect. There's a wonderful quote from author Kazuo Ishiguro, a Nobel Prize winner, who says, stories are about one person saying to another, this is the way it feels to me. Can you understand what I'm saying? Does it also feel this way to you? So can you understand what I'm saying? Clarity is the first hurdle. So let's focus there for a moment. A good storyteller uses a sequence of actions. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, that then creates tension and resolves it. But then this happened. What will happen next? You have questions and you're hardwired to want answers. So you'll continue to listen. Okay, then that happened. That's the resolution. Okay. So your friend can be a good storyteller talking about their weekend. And you're like, that's a good story. He's a good storyteller, whatever. Can they do our jobs? I'd argue not. Because what we need is something more than clarity. We need that next part of the Ishiguro quote. Does it also feel this way to you? Connection. In other words, yes, we speak with sequences of events. We create and resolve tension. That's why people stick around. But we also ensure, and have to go to great lengths to do so, that the audience is reflecting and acting based on what they heard. And so sometimes we have to dole it out overtly. Maybe it's audio. Audio is a particularly didactic medium, says Ira Glass. You have to spoon feed people bit by bit because there's nothing to scan or go back to. And so, okay, I'm going to give you the meaning of the story. Is it video? That's a show medium instead of a tell medium like audio is. Maybe I give you space to watch, to observe. That's what Bourdain did with music and B-roll so often, is something just happened. I got to give you a little space, a little transition to let that synthesize. And you're going to do the synthesis, not my words, right? Or writing or whatever. So creating that connection is ensuring that they basically move from the action of the story to its meaning. Right. So a story from your friend over the weekend, you're not reflecting on your own life as a result of that story. Most likely, you're not changing a behavior or taking an action or going to subscribe to his newsletter or buy something from him necessarily. He can still be a good storyteller. But for us, we have to be an effective storyteller. We're in the business of action. We're in the business of ensuring others care. And in other words, resonating, not just reaching people, but resonating with them. And no amount of reach can guarantee that they care. So we really need to master that in and of itself. It's its own craft. This ability to resonate. So I sum it up as, go ahead and create all your stuff privately that you want because it benefits you. And then eventually you come out publicly and it'll show up in the work for others too. Fantastic. But remember, the job is not to be a good storyteller. The job is to be an effective storyteller. And while good storytellers can grip us, effective storytellers can move us. And that's what we need to do. We need to move others, whether it's moving their understanding, shifting how they think, or mostly shifting how they act, taking some kind of action, because that's where our results come from.
I like that difference between good storytelling and effective storytelling, because I'm sure you've seen this in the marketing space, but I've always struggled with what storytelling seems to mean, or what people mean when they say that. But something I've been noodling on, because I was rereading your Break the Wheel book, and I think I read it a couple of years ago. Whenever you published it, right? I read
It
the
was
physical copy.
2018, and thank you for reading it, by the way.
Yeah, totally. But I remember this the story that you introduced the book with, the story of Death Wish Coffee.
Yeah.
And yeah, as I was like, I was going through the audiobook, which also thank you for narrating it. Just to go on a side tangent, for some reason, like in my mind, I cannot pay attention when there's a professional narrator. I don't, do you have any theories on that?
As a podcaster, it never entered my mind that I'd allow anybody else to read the words I just like so painstakingly wrote for my book. However, listening back, I remember we had just had my daughter, who's now 3, but she was an infant. So I was like so profoundly tired when I was narrating that. And then on top of it, we were living in a home that didn't have really like a home office. And so like I kind of had stitched together this little home studio, like half of a bedroom with pillows and sheets and all this. So I'm recording it, like in my office through fits and starts. And I have like a hoarse voice, and I'm really shouty. Like it's funny because you look back at these things that people go, oh, that was pretty good. And I'm like, well, if I did it now, it'd be so much better. So thank you for listening to the audiobook, but I'm cringing a little bit knowing you did.
No, I like the rough draft. When it's too polished, it's weird to me.
Yeah.
But anyway, like something I was noodling on during that story is that story is really like a vehicle to transport a kernel of truth or something that you want to transmit, a piece of information or an insight. And you used effectively this Death Wish story to transmit the truth that like you don't always have to follow the best practices. And in fact, sometimes the inverse of what the best practice is actually the best practice for you. So I think that sometimes storytelling is this looming, like kind of generic thing, but it's like, if you're trying to transport cargo, maybe a train is the best way to do that. If you're trying to like get from LA to New York, like maybe a plane is the best way to do that. So there's different types of stories that maybe effectively, transport those specific types of truths. And I don't know, maybe this sounds a little esoteric, but what does storytelling mean in marketing?
You're totally right. I think there's 2 things that I want to maybe pull out from that. So, because that's such a good point. So one is, the types of stories you end up kind of collecting into your bag of stories as an author and a speaker and a public performer. And then, because what you're really doing as an author is you're in sales. You're trying to show up everywhere you go, digitally or in person, and spark some kind of change, spark an action, right? Like you're trying to get an outcome. And mostly it's, I want you to see the world a certain way, and I want you to adopt what I think is the right vision for this movement, or a new way of thinking about something, or a big idea, or deeper understanding, or whatever. And then, also like pick up the book, take the course, whatever it might be, hire me to speak, whatever the outcome is for a particular author. So authors are kind of in sales, but you travel everywhere as this sort of like quote unquote traveling salesperson with a very small bag of stories, and it doesn't feel that way to the audience. So like, I'll put a pin in that. We should come back to it. But the thing you pointed out there was, it gets muddied, right? In our world, like what storytelling and story and all these things, which is remarkable to me, because effectively what's happened is this notion of story has gotten so jargony and so abstracted and so dense, even, or maybe it's misconstrued as something, it's got to be a giant story, it's got to be big. Effectively, what we've done as marketers is we've turned story into a buzzword, which is like chefs turning food into a buzzword. Like it's just supposed to be what we do. And so back to the Ishiguro quote, when he says it's about one person saying to another, this is how it feels to me. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does it also feel this way to you? What he's implying is, and you can kind of put an X-ray lens over that quote, and there's a lot of, I'm this, you're this. I'm saying, you're feeling. I'm saying, you're thinking. It's a dialogue between 2 people. And that dialogue unfolds by the speaker conveying a sequence of actions that creates and resolves tension or questions, if you will. That's it. It's just, so stories are wonderful vehicles about a change or about overcoming something, about solving a problem. It's just a communication device that uses a sequence of actions that creates and resolves tension. But of course, it has to have some kind of meaning, right? And so that's where you get effective. But what Ishiguro knows that we've lost sight of is you really can't abstract it away. Like, it's nice that we have all these posts like the rationale for story for brands, or the science of story structure to adopt, like all these things, they're very abstract. But what ends up happening is we gather up those ingredients, and it's all we can carry. It's like, it's really straining us to like keep it all straight, figure it all out. Then we go to face our daily work, and we open Twitter and we see one of those smug looking bros tweet something like how to 10x your marketing in 10 months. And we go, oh, that seems easier. And we drop all the story stuff. And so what Ishiguro knows is that actually it's not about the abstracted story, it's about the storyteller. So it's on each of us to become effective storytellers. And I think we can do that without having a giant story, without having a million stories. I think we can be effective with stories of any size, found through any source, and actually told to any audience, because as an author, you are forced to learn that you're showing up today on a leadership podcast and tomorrow on a marketing podcast. You're giving a talk to this conference and then that conference. This is a modern group of marketers. This is a legacy brand you're speaking to. It's long form, it's short form, it's text, it's audio, it's video. You got to create a ton of stuff without a ton of resources. And oh, by the way, it has to be high quality and very entertaining and very educational. And I'm very exhausted just thinking about this, right? And so you take the same story and you accentuate, you omit, you add details that this audience might need to hear or that audience might need to hear to arrive at the meaning of the story at the end of it all that is perfectly tailored for them. So they go, whoa, that story was perfect for me. It was about a dictionary brand or a coffee brand, Death Wish Coffee, but I'm in marketing and B2B, and that was like perfectly tailored to me. Yes, because I didn't just tell you the story, I molded it for you. But tomorrow I'm going to mold it slightly differently for them. And so I guess the punchline of this rant here is there's this very useful technique for storytellers to remember, not only to become effective, to extract meaning from stories and hopefully spark action, but also to customize stories everywhere you go, even if you only have one to tell. The phrase is, that's the thing about. So you tell the story and then you arrive at this moment where you're like, okay, that's the thing about goals. We don't set goals correctly when it's time to reach higher or do better work. We're actually hurting our own cause. And maybe we should rethink it in this way or that way, right? You extract the meaning by getting to this moment where you're like, okay, that's the thing about the theme of the story, right? It's like a good story could be told about an obnoxious little boy, a flock of sheep, and a gruesome crime scene, but it is not yet The Boy Who Cried Wolf until you go, that's the thing about lying. If you become known as a liar, people won't believe you when you're telling the truth, right? And people, oh wow, okay, I better not lie. Right. It's affecting me. I'm acting as a result. Even if the action is, I understand it better, that's still valuable to our cause. But hopefully beyond that, they go, I'll stop lying. I'll think twice when I lie. Right. So just remember that phrase to tip from a good storyteller to an effective storyteller, or to customize the same story for different audiences, is that's the thing about. And that it can be a different thing or a different about. In other words, you extract a different insight everywhere you go, depending on who you're speaking to or what subsection of the audience you're speaking to and what they need to hear.
It's interesting. I think almost storytelling is a way to make something sticky in somebody's brain. But I'm thinking back, we did a podcast with Matthew Dix, who wrote Storyworthy, and he describes different movie narratives and how Jurassic
Connecticut
Park,
Connecticut native. Sorry to interrupt, but Connecticut native, just like I grew up in Connecticut. So yeah,
he was fantastic. I mean, in his book, he writes about Jurassic Park, and it's like it's not about dinosaurs. It's about the transformation between, not wanting kids to loving kids, or, and it's like, if you just said that, the story would be over in a second and nobody would remember it. But you have this it sounds almost like a negative way to say it, but like a bait and switch. It's like you start the story by describing this Death Wish coffee company and how they flip the script, and the truck driver who comes in and wants this strong and dark coffee. But if you had just said best practices aren't always true, it's like somebody could read that and they're going to forget about it tomorrow. But then you give them almost, you give them a little hook, like a coat hanger in their brain to hold something, it's like a vehicle, a container that they can keep that with them by almost concretizing something a little abstract.
Yeah. One of my favorite examples of this I learned about in one of my favorite books. I very rarely read books about work, but the one I recommend to everybody it's called Out on the Wire, by a creative coach and also a cartoonist named Jessica Abel. Out on the Wire. And she embeds herself with some of the best podcasting storytellers ever. This American Life, Radiolab, 99% Invisible, Snap Judgment, Planet Money. And she goes into their storytelling process of how they put the show together. And it's not so in the weeds that it's only for podcasters. It's very useful for anybody doing anything meant to resonate. And she breaks it up in sections so you can kind of flip through it, okay, I want to get better at this part. And it's also packaged as a cartoon strip because she's a cartoonist. So she is the narrator. She's outside of the panels, along with her, the person who wrote the foreword to this book, Ira Glass himself. because years and years ago, she did a project for This American Life. So they got to know each other and she got all this access. So it's a wonderful book, super inside access to masterful storytellers. In the book, there's an example of this moment, and they don't use the words good versus effective, but they're talking about like what makes a gripping story. Why would people proceed with you? Like, why is a story going to stick in your mind? To your point, the Death Wish story that I told in the beginning of the book. Why is that going to be sticky? Why is it going to be resonant? And Ira Glass goes on to say, well, let me give you an example. Early in the show's run, they were telling the story about a guy named Brett, this kind of nondescript guy that you don't care about. He's not a celebrity. The name of the episode is not like Brett Smith, the famous person you care about. Click on the episode. No. He's on the New York City subway, this guy, Brett. And Ira Glass is describing this situation. And what he says is, so Brett's on the subway in New York City. It's rush hour. It's mobbed. And down the platform, he sees this guy. And this guy comes up to each individual he meets, stands a little bit too close, says something, and moves on. And he's nicely dressed. He's not like asking for money, but he keeps doing this thing. He'd walk up to someone, say, stand too close, say something softly, and move to the next person. And as he's getting closer, Brett can hear what he's saying. And so I'll just stop there. And I'll ask you, Alex, do you want me to continue that story? Do you want Ira Glass to keep going?
Yeah, totally.
Yes. Why? Because what are you wondering?
There's like a chasm, I guess. Like there's some sort of a loop in my mind that feels open. Exactly. And like I naturally want to like close that and like answer that curiosity.
Totally. Gap. And the questions are, so it's really, I have introduced questions, or in this case, it's Ira Glass's story. He's introduced questions. Who is the guy, right? Are we going to learn that? What is he saying? What will he say to Brett when he arrives at our protagonist? And so the story continues. He gets, keeps going up to each person, and Brett hears what he's saying. He's going up to one person going, you can stay. And the next person he's going, you got to go. And the next person, you can stay. You got to go. And then Brett's getting a little nervous, he says. He's like, I kind of want to know what he's going to say to me. And Ira's like, he's not choosing you for anything, man. And Brett laughs and he's like, I know. But then Brett finishes the story. Ira Glass finishes that on his behalf. And he says, he walks up to Brett, stands a little too close and says, you can stay. And Brett feels euphoria, which is weird. He knows in his mind that there's no reason to be so excited that this random person on the subway said, you can stay, but he feels excited in his mind, but he knows it's not rational, but his heart feels really happy. So just to conclude that is a good storyteller in action. Like Ira Glass there speaks in a series of events, a sequence of events that he describes with enough detail that you're there. And he also introduces questions or introduces tension, and you want the resolution. Like you said, the open loop is there and you are hardwired for closure, right? So you're a good storyteller in that way, or Ira Glass is, but he's not yet an effective storyteller because I don't think we're really reflecting on anything about our lives, having heard that story. And we're certainly not like inspired to take any kind of action to change anything. And then he says this one little thing in the story, which is, I'm like, that's it. So back to that's the thing about moment. He goes, well, that's the thing about strangers. It's like just by virtue of them being strangers, they have some instantaneous insight into who we really are when we aren't trying to impress our friends or the people we work with. Oh, okay. So the story is about something that we might not care about or might care about. It's about strangers. That's the thing about strangers. And then this is the thing. This is the insight, right? And that insight applies to our work.
Essentially.
Right. So now we're like going to maybe go outside after listening to that and bump into a neighbor that we distantly know, or even another stranger. Or maybe we're on a subway platform listening to this podcast. Like that is an insight capable of helping us reflect and helping us maybe act. In other words, he moves us from the action to the meaning of the story. So in that moment, he evolves from good storyteller to effective storyteller, right? In that little instance. Of course, overall, he is a very effective storyteller. So that's an example of like, all of these heady ideas of story and the abstraction of it all. No, when we step into the role of communicators, it's just about what are we doing and how as we communicate. So no one is going to ask you to answer a question on a podcast in story. That's your choice. You got to just decide to do it, right? So that's the posture of an effective storyteller. Then there's also the skill of an effective storyteller. You're not just going to give the sequence of events, even the most gripping sequence that introduces and resolves tension. You're also going to ensure there's some kind of meaning that is extracted, whether you overtly do it like Ira Glass did, or you give someone the space they need to kind of figure it out themselves. But either way, you have to move them from the action to the meaning or else you're not going to get that you're not going to inspire any change in them.
Do people get frustrated when there's no clear meaning? Like when you are gripped with an entertaining, mysterious story, it's resolved, but then there's kind of like no takeaways? Or how does the audience feel in those cases?
I don't think that's I don't think that's ever quite the case if you're paying attention, that there's no meaning to the story. Because like even your friend telling you a story about the weekend, there's this kind of meta level or foundational meaning of like, I'm getting closer to my buddy Alex, right? And so that's great. I'm watching the new Lord of the Rings series on Amazon Prime, and it's like, there's meaning, right? There's good versus evil. There's in the classic story tropes, what is the tension? What's the conflict? Is it human versus human versus society, human versus self? There's all these like sort of stereotypes or, kind of lanes you can slot into to bring out the tension. And sometimes shows have a lot of those. So like there's always this deeper meaning in I think the stories that we really admire. It's really hard, I think, for something to just fall flat and not have any meaning. The question becomes, however, when you're doing this on behalf of a cause, a brand, a nonprofit, some kind of vision you have or change, are you marching people towards that mountain peak that you think we all need to get to, right? It's like the classic brand narrative. You and I mentioned HubSpot earlier. We worked for HubSpot. For years, marketers were doing a certain playbook, and that was fine. But then the social media era came and the internet era came, and now consumers have all the choice. So they navigate around stuff they don't want to choose, stuff they don't want. That's the tension. The resolution to the story: inbound marketing, create marketing people love, create great content, be that which they choose, because they have all the power, they have all the choice, right? And oh, by the way, we sell tools and services and all these things for that story, if that story is yours. In other words, that is, I have a vision for where we need to go. So when I tell a story that supports that, I want to ensure that the meaning you're extracting aligns with that vision. So I think that's the difference. It's really hard to have a story with no meaning, but you should have an idea of why you're telling that story, what you're trying to arrive at. When I tell the Death Wish Coffee story on a stage to a general audience of marketers, I am very hardwired to know where I'm trying to arrive at the end of that story. So I'm trying to accentuate certain details or bring out big questions that land us there. But then I might talk to a niche audience. Like as a speaker, you talk to some random audiences. I've spoken at the world's biggest dentistry conference, right? Like I'm a marketing person from a SaaS business. What do I have to say to them? I'm an author who loves creativity. What do I have to say to them? I have to figure it out. What is their problem? What do they need to hear? Where am I trying to lead them? And so maybe there's that's the thing about moment. So I think it's a really good question. I think it's actually about intentionality of where you want to lead people.
Right. I want to go back to the story about the strangers on the subway, and I'm kind of inferring between the lines here, but it sounds like the responsibility of a story has a large part to do with sort of mystery and tension. And then I started thinking about how that also requires on the audience, like their responsibility is a certain degree of patience, right, to get to that payoff. And then from that, like to extend further, like the storyteller has a lot of responsibilities, but especially now in this day and age with so much noise, a large part of that is capturing the attention and giving the promise that it's worth being patient, and actually getting to that resolution. Because like in my own life, right? Like I read Dune a couple of years ago when I knew the new movie was going to come out, and it took me like, I don't know, 50, 80 pages before I was actually interested, but I was patient enough because I had so many friends promise me that it was worth it. It was almost like the social proof promise. Or like back in the day when Game of Thrones was a thing, I had plenty of friends say, oh, I watched the first 2 episodes. I just couldn't get in. And I was like, please watch until the end of the first season. You're going to like it. So I don't know. Do you think that one, that's true? Like there's a big impetus on like the initial kind of promise? Like, do you think that's kind of like the main hook that gets somebody in? And is that getting harder nowadays? Like, I feel like there's so much noise and people just want just give me it. Just give me the TLDR.
Yeah. It's an interesting problem. I think when we talk about like, oh, the world's trending short form because you can't hold attentions or attentions are shortening, I don't think people don't have a lower tolerance for long form things. They have a lower tolerance for mediocre things. And so that's what people are saying is like, oh, you got to make snackable content, or like content marketing takes forever to yield results, or people don't spend any time with this stuff. It's like, yeah, because they have endless choice of amazing things. So like, you have to up your game. You have to understand how to be an effective storyteller. You have to understand how to hook people, but also deliver on the hook. So I think in a bygone era where there's less choice, maybe you can kind of like put the hook aside and bury the lead a little bit, and people take a while to ease into it and blah, blah, blah. Fine. Today, I think what we're experiencing is the other extreme, where people are basically pure hook and they don't deliver on the promise, right? They're super hooky. They're like 10x results in 10 days, right? And then what they give you is like, number one, have a website. And you're like, all right, I'm out. You know, like
clickbait, right?
100%. Like that is pure hook, pure promise, not delivering. It's an open loop that feels burning. I really want to know the answer. I really want closure. And it's so unsatisfying. It doesn't match this. The stakes were raised to the nth degree, 10 out of 10 intention. And the resolution went 1 out of 10. And so now you have this misalignment between what was promised and what was delivered, which is awful for marketing, for sales, for communication, bottom line, for trust. That's what this is all about. It's about trust. I mean, that's our jobs. There's only 2 levers of marketing. There is, can you earn trust? Can you spark action? I think we get into trouble when we don't know this thing we're doing. What is it meant for? Are we trying to earn trust? Or are we trying to spark an action? Sometimes it happens at the same time, mostly not, right? So like, have we earned enough trust to ask them to do this thing? Are we trying to skip ahead for our own gain because we haven't actually laid that groundwork? So that's the 2 levers we have to pull. But so is it getting harder? No, I don't think it's getting harder to hold attention or even grab attention. I think it's getting harder, or the hard part is we have to be way more intentional in selecting our audience. In other words, we can't have happen what you just described about Dune. We can't have the people who are like, maybe this sounds somewhat relevant, or I could get this information everywhere. I happen to find it here. We need to go further and harder towards our core beliefs, towards the premise. Like we need well-developed premises of podcasts or video shows, well-developed theses or open loops or the purpose of the piece we're writing today. We just have to have a lot more clarity before we begin as creators. And like I said before, if you have a private practice, a lot of that clarity is hard won through creating. You're slogging through the jungle and you found a path. It's really hard to pick that out in theory, which is why so much clarity happens in the making process. And if you can't do it in a day job, do it on the side. So when you arrive at the day job, you're better. It's like practice and the game. So I don't know if it's getting harder once you start producing the piece, because I think the principles are always the same. I think now it's incumbent on us to really lead with the things that will bring people way into our corners initially, instead of like a lot of milquetoast content or a lot of quote unquote relevant content that really fails to do anything but get in front of people. Because that's not the job. The job is not getting in front of people. The job is to ensure they care. So in our arms race for reach, the premium marketing skill today is resonance.
Did you always know you were interested in storytelling? Like as a kid, did you read a ton of fiction and fantasy and
constantly?
Like how did when was the first time you knew you were interested in storytelling and this was going to be something you were going to be heavily involved in?
Yeah, something I would do. I'm not so sure about that question. I think it was always like, I had wonderful English teachers in grade school and in high school. And I remember my high school English teacher, Mr. Shred, Jack Shred, had an enormous impact on me. He was this sort of like short, squat little guy, round glasses and like he always had a little flop sweat on his like wispy gray hair and really red in the cheeks when he'd read us like Huck Finn or Gatsby. But he would make these things come alive. Like he was a stickler in the margins. What he married for me was the slog and the commitment and the obligation of the practice and the emotion and the awe and the reverence and the respect for the craft and the kind of the outcome with the audience. Because on one hand, he's measuring the margins of our papers to ensure it's uniform. And on the other hand, he's reading us Huck Finn, like balancing a tattered copy on his, away in his arm outstretched. Or at the end of Gatsby, he'd reach outside the classroom with that final line, like something was out there, the light away in the distance. And I'm like, I know nothing is out there. Like I just came in the door. Nothing is out, but something is definitely out there right now, And so it was that beautiful marriage. And I think that's like why I like this craft so much is here's all these marginalia, quite literally, that we can control. Here's all this stuff. Why am I shipping? I take a new girl approach, or sorry, not new girl, mean girl approach to shipping. On Mondays we wear pink or whatever the line is. On Fridays I ship. Why am I shipping? Because it's a Friday. Not because I'm inspired, not because I feel good, not because this is the best idea ever, because it's Friday. And on Fridays I ship. So there's an obligation, there's a craft, there's a certain ugliness to what actually goes on in the minutia, but that's where it happens to get to, as Bourdain said, this golden moment where you look at something and you go, that's pretty good, right? This appreciation, this addiction you feel in that moment. And that's why it drives me so bonkers that like creative people don't consume their work. They're like embarrassed by it, or they're like, I never watch my speeches. I never listen to my podcasts. I never read my writing. You just work so hard to make something exist that didn't before. Take a moment and just appreciate the fact that it does. And then, oh, by the way, it's game tape. It's the ability you have
100%.
to reflect back on your work and be like, oh, I felt bored in that moment. And if I felt bored in that moment, the audience felt twice as bored in that moment. So I better like re-engineer something next time. So every time I publish an episode of Unthinkable, I still geek out. We're about to hit 200 episodes. And that's just of that show. I've made shows for brands for part of my career. And I've probably done over 1,000 episodes of just podcast, to say nothing of video. And I still see it show up in my podcast player alongside my hero shows. And I'm still like, this is so cool. I worked so hard for this. I'm going to go listen to it while I walk the dog and appreciate these moments. And those little tiny things I did in the edit that made me cackle to myself alone in the office, I want to experience those when it's not in the wave form, when it's not like a sort of staccato or broken up listening experience. I want the whole thing. I want to enjoy the meal. And while I'm doing that, I'm picking up pointers for future me to try and get better.
Yeah, I tend to like not black out, but I get so tunnel vision in these conversations that I actually, we publish them about 2 months later because we've got a good backlog. And I listen to it again and I'm like, I don't even, this is awesome. Like, this was really insightful what the guy said here. So it's kind of like I get the almost first impression that an audience would, but I'm pretty ruthless on like the game tape aspect too. Like I really comb back through and I try to improve my craft. Like, I think that's one aspect of taking it very seriously and something that I've heard comedians talk about, right? Like they tape themselves and they go back over their performance and they're like, okay, that didn't land. Like, I got to fix that. Like, maybe beef up the premise a little bit. Punchline, maybe like add 2 seconds there to like let it resonate. And they go back and that's how they perfect their performance. Greats like George Carlin, incredibly meticulous, right? And it's so uncomfortable to go back through and see yourself, especially hearing your voice for most people. Yeah.
That's why I love like Mike Birbiglia's podcast, Working It Out, where he talks to comedians. In part, the episode is about working out material with each other. And the wordsmithing they're doing is so detailed. And, as an author talking about resonance, I'm trying to figure out, is there a book on how to be their favorite, how to be an effective storyteller, how to resonate? I don't quite know what the idea is yet, but resonance will play a big role in the future book. And it's like, okay, well, what is the definition of resonance? And also like, it's from audio, it's from like a frequency in science. Okay, what does the science say? You do these weird things that feel like you're like down this pinprick of a hole in the ground. You're like way down this very narrow thing. But then you start to figure out like, okay, now I can go back up to the surface and really have an impact there and like really dig this well broader. The other day I was at Content Marketing World giving a speech and I was talking to my friend Ann Handley, wonderful writer. Like, if you're in marketing and you want to learn how to write well, like she's the person, right? She's author of the bestseller Everybody Writes. The second edition's coming out this October. She's got a really popular newsletter called Total Anarchy. We were talking about her brand new talk she debuted, and we weren't talking about like, we did say like, oh, that was awesome, whatever, big things. But then we got really detailed, and because she used this point from Stranger Things, the show. Their captions have been wowing people. That the human written closed captioning is super descriptive in Stranger Things. And there's a lot of press about that right now. And they use words like squelchy and moist and things like that to describe the monsters. So she had played that up. And then she got to this perfect moment in her speech where she was saying, instead of creating content like this, create it like this. Instead of this, create it like this. So it was, instead of bad, good, right? She was doing this comparative moment to like rev you up. And I was waiting for her to land where she would say, instead of dry, moist and squelchy. Like, it would have been the perfect encapsulation, like nice little rounded edge or period on that sentence. And she didn't deliver it, but I could sense that it could come and wow the audience. So afterwards, that's what we're talking about. I literally said, like a comedian, I'm like, I wrote a line or I wrote a button at the end of that bit for you. Like, let's talk about it. And then we started going down this rabbit hole. And so like, people will say, oh, I don't have time for that, or I'm not a professional speaker, or I'm not Ann Handley. And all I'll say is like, no problem. Do it once in a while, or do it once. And what you'll see is this sort of cascading effect where it's like getting a sniff of some delicious cookies in the kitchen next door. I guarantee you're going to follow that scent for the rest of your day until you get the cookies, until you're like, this, I created something delicious here and I'm tasting it and it's awesome. Right. So I'm not asking you to like suddenly be Ann Handley or suddenly have all the time to focus on your craft the way she does, because she is a professional author and speaker. But once in a while, we have to reflect. Because if we're not reflecting on our work, and the goal of an effective storyteller is to inspire reflection in others, how do we expect for that to happen? It won't. And we're going to get this banal, commodified content day after day after day that is ineffectual. So it is in the name of results that we're doing this. This is not some woo-woo conversation. You're trying to spark action. This is the path to it. It's all the little moments add up to do that. It's not just the big stuff, which I think is profoundly encouraging, because we control those far better without more resources, without having some magical pipeline of big stories no one's told. Like, the beauty of all this resonance stuff is it's the stuff well within our grasp, no matter the resources we have. We can't all have 1 million followers or people paying attention to us. We can't all be on the keynote stage, no matter how hard we try. And I hope more people will. But man, we can control the moments that cause someone to throw up their hands and go, oh my God, that was for me.
Yeah, I want to take one nugget that you mentioned there and kind of pull that out a little bit and send a hot take your way. I'm trying to distill patterns that I see in great content marketers, which is really like the facsimile for like creatives, people who, think outside of the box, like things that, you can always index on past experience, but it's usually priced in. So what does like an underdeveloped, like hidden talent, what do they exhibit? And I think that curiosity is the big thing. It's kind of a bedrock of like creativity in many ways. And because I was just thinking like that, the Stranger Things thing, like normies don't notice that stuff,
Right.
And like, I'm the type of guy who I go for a walk and I'm like, oh, I wonder what that leaf is. Like, I wonder, does like vitamin D absorption like depend on the time of the day? And I wonder like to what degree? And like my brain is constantly filled with these things, and it's like this loop has to close. So then, I go research most of these things and end up in rabbit holes. I give this example too many times on the podcast, but I watched Malcolm Gladwell's masterclass, and it's interesting hearing how he like structures, his articles and like how he does his research. But what I found the most interesting is that this guy is pathologically curious and passionate about weird things that nobody else ever seems to care about. The thought might enter their brain, but he can't stop until he figures it out. He walks through a grocery aisle and he sees that there's 100 brands of mustard and like 1 brand of ketchup. And he's like, why is that? And then you get this like 10,000 word New Yorker piece all about that.
He noticed something. Isn't that funny? It's just something mundane that he noticed. And I was listening to the podcast I mentioned this morning. Mike Birbiglia is working it out, and they re-aired an episode with comedian Pete Holmes. And Pete was saying like, he gets very mystical and just existential, that guy. And he was talking about how like, it's kind of nuts, this life thing. We're like, we look outside at the sun, which is a star that happens to be close enough to warm us, or like we don't stop to think. It's weird that we're buying pants. Like, some people will just like go through those motions and like fake it. And he's like, everyone else is like, oh, this is a little weird, or you're noticing things. He's like, so if you're sensitive, and Birbiglia talked about a moment in a YMCA pool when he was a kid and smelling the chlorine and feeling the moisture like it was somehow about to rain indoors. And Pete stopped him. He's like, okay, so for the listeners, if you felt what Mike just felt when he described it, if you know exactly what he's talking about, he's like, you're like 70% of a comedian already because you're sensitive. And so I think that's what we need: more sensitive marketers, executives, people in business where it tends to be colder and more callous, right? Where we tend to sort of like either have come from a culture of gray cubicles and drab spreadsheets, or it is still that culture. It's sort of prioritized because it's somehow like cold hard facts, numbers, finance, right? But actually being sensitive to the world doesn't mean you weep when you see a dying flower. It means you sense things. It means your spidey senses tingle, like, why is that? Or this sucks, and no one is calling it out. Like, that's where innovation happens. That's where creative leaders emerge. That's where really groundbreaking ideas impress people, inspire them, and cause that action, like to become a member of your audience, to buy your product, to join your cause and your movement. And we don't have enough of that sort of sensitivity to the world. And so the analogy I use is always very similar. If you want to start that process, if you want to like either reignite or ignite that curiosity, think of the analogy of lighting a match. Like, find what frustrates you about the audience you want to speak to, the community, the thing they're going for, the industry. That's like lighting a match. Like before I wrote Break the Wheel, I was like, why is there so much basic commodity average content? We don't aspire to be average. No one would admit that. So why is that like the norm for what we mostly create? Right. So that was a match I lit. And what most people do, because when you hold a match too long, what happens? You get burned. Right. It's pretty useless just to light a match. And so that's like mostly Twitter. It's like mostly people just like annoy themselves or others or complain or get frustrated, like because they just let their frustrations hurt them. But a creative person goes, oh, I'm going to light some kindling now. That's curiosity. Like, this sucks. And then you start going,
why?
Yeah, it does suck. Does anyone else see it this way? Back to the Ishiguro quote. Or why does it suck? Has it always been this way? Who does it differently? What can we learn in history? What can we learn in science? What other examples exist that like reaffirm or fly in the face of this feeling I have or this observation? And questions lead to questions, lead to questions, lead to questions, which other people go, you're a genius, or you're so prolific, or you have this insight. And you're like, no, I'm just really frustrated and really curious, and I'm asking a lot of questions. So from the match to the kindling to this like raging fire of creativity. But to your point, it is this trait is curiosity. And like, it's just not present enough in our work.
It's very hard to, I think people get in, their brains start to like develop grooves and they do the same things and they kind of get on autopilot. And I've found that like, I end up like that sometimes. And the way I've gotten myself out of that and kind of more into a mindful state of noticing of sensitivity, travel helps. I find that like talking to people with different backgrounds and different viewpoints, like that usually shakes me up. Even taking a different walk when I walk my dog, like basically anything that I can do to like get myself outside of the normal autopilot mode. And then I start thinking, and
Genius.
oh man, reading biographies about people who think like this. There's that. It's a really popular biography on Leonardo da Vinci, and it starts out. He's just like the ultimate case of somebody who's like perennially curious. But it starts out with an anecdote of he had like several pages in his notebooks just diagramming and writing about the motion and speed of a hummingbird's tongue, and like he just couldn't get this idea out of his head. And he kept trying to like figure it out. It's like reading stuff like that makes me think, like when I go for a walk or something, it makes me wonder more about the world in that same way.
I love the example of walking on a different side of the street. So why does travel get held up as one of these things that inspires you, right? Like you go on these grand adventures or see these amazing things in the world and you're so inspired and maybe so creative or whatever. I don't think it's that you're staring at the Grand Canyon or the Mona Lisa or a jungle. I think it's that you are forced, when you are not in the routine, in these daily grooves you've made for yourself, to be very mindful of everything around you. In other words, it is a hack to be more sensitive to the world around you. And so that's what travel does. But we can engineer little moments of that constantly, right? I think frustration is one of those, because the frustrating moments cause you to break from your like mindless flow. There's this psychological phenomenon called cultural fluency, which is when things are as they always are or as you think they should be, you just kind of go with it. You just go with it. There's like actual studies done that like, if you were to like go to a barbecue and the plate matches the holiday, you take a lot of food because it's a gorge yourself type holiday. But if the plate is like Halloween and it's 4th of July, it breaks you from that flow and you're suddenly aware that, okay, this something is off. I'm paying more attention, which means you pay more attention when you scoop food onto your plate. This is from a researcher in Chicago named Jim Murray. And so like it breaks you from your cultural fluency. It breaks you from the daily mindlessness of decision-making and, the banalities of life to travel. Again, you can engineer that every day. Moments of frustration do that. Questions do that. Crossing the street to walk in a different direction does that beautifully. Routines are great. But when we start to cling to them too much, we start to sort of numb ourselves to the world. We're not sensitive, which then dulls our creative output. So I'm not saying you have to be this like radical all over the place, like kind of traveling, with your guitar everywhere. There's a cultural stereotype about that. But I am saying once in a while, pay attention to those frustrations. Ask those questions that are a little scary that no one seems to be asking. Speak up about the stuff you think is broken, where people are not saying it is. And they go, oh my God, yeah, why? And you go, I don't know. I'm going to go figure this out. I'm going to go ask. I'm going to go investigate. I'm going to create. cross to the other side of the street, and suddenly you find yourself way more creative.
I wanted to ask you about another thread line that I'm thinking through, kind of the flip side to curiosity, or maybe a compliment. So I think if you're just curious, you can end up down these rabbit holes of like, well, you can get lost in rabbit holes, and you can kind of get lost in the pursuit of perfection when it comes to creating the actual content. So something I've noticed, I think you can disagree with me on this, but I think your podcast and a lot of your work, a thread line through it is creativity, right? It's how to step outside and be creative. Like that's a very broad umbrella, but something that I am thinking about is that I think courage and bravery maybe are themes that underlie that. They're just underneath the surface of creativity. You had an episode, I think it was called Working Bravely, that talked about like literally the first step was just like asking to be put on stage. It wasn't about giving a talk. Right. It wasn't about giving a successful talk. It was about shipping. Yeah. And you had mentioned that word shipping too. We ship on Fridays. So would you agree with this? And why do you think these traits, because I've heard a lot in your work about bravery, about stepping outside, break the wheel, I could argue is literally all about bravery and less about like creativity and outside of best practices. So why do you think those traits are salient for you in your work?
There's so much in there. We should probably pull out two things. So there's the idea of sort of productive curiosity, because you can go down a rabbit hole of intellectual curiosity and never ship anything, or you're like, I'm going to write this thing about this concept, but I didn't do like a statistically significant analysis of every research report ever written about this, right? So there is sort of a delay towards perfectionism. Like there's a problem sometimes with going down those rabbit holes. So we should talk about that. We should also talk about this idea of bravery, but let's start there. So on the show, we talked to these two marketing entrepreneurs named Andrew and Pete, and their brand name is Andrew and Pete. And they would go on stages. That was their act, Andrew and Pete. And before they were like marketing world famous, they, I'm talking like thousands of people have seen them speak at a given time. They were trying to just get out there. They were just trying to get on the circuit. And what they said was, we had some ideas, we had given some talks, and we're like, all right, our audience is small business owners and entrepreneurs, maybe marketers. So we knew like being on podcasts would help. And they said, well, the first step to being on a podcast was just to get on the first podcast. And so they criticized on the show the idea that like you have to work harder to get on all these podcasts, or you have to work smarter to get on these podcasts. They're like, I think you have to work more bravely in most of our scenarios. And so they pitched a much larger podcast than they felt ready to actually pitch. And the guy said yes. And so their very first podcast was to like thousands of people instead of to like a few hundred. And they were like, we didn't work any extra, like it wasn't more difficult to pitch that podcaster than someone with a smaller audience. We didn't have to work like smarter somehow. There wasn't like some re-engineering of our schedule or our life to pitch that person. We just did something slightly braver. There was more fear present and we proceeded anyway, right? Because if you are like me and have kids, or you just like Disney and Pixar movies, so you hear over and over again, like I'm scared. Oh yeah, I know it's okay to be scared. Bravery is not no fear. It's proceeding even when you are afraid, right? That's what courage, that's what bravery is. So that's what Andrew and Pete have done all throughout their careers. And the way I frame it is, you think of second order effects. Like you're like, oh, if I do this, this will happen, but then that'll lead to all these other things. I think there are second order problems, and we focus on second order problems to our own detriment. What I mean by that is, say you wanted to create a podcast yourself, and you're like working really hard to try and figure out the perfect podcast. And it's all like, I got to do all these things and it's got to be great. And I'm the biggest guest and all these things. Delay. Why? Because you're focused on a second order problem, brilliance. You want the podcast to be brilliant, but you actually aren't facing that problem yet. You're facing the first problem, the first order problem, which is momentum. You haven't started. You've never made a podcast before. So you need to make the switch from not having podcasted to podcasting. And then once you're podcasting, once you're like, I know how to do this like mechanically, then you're like, okay, how do I make it amazing? Right? How do I close the gap between what my vision is and what my skills are allowing me to do? I'm going to do that over time. So focus on the real problem. You have a momentum problem, solve that problem. Like you're trying to engineer the best written piece in the world, but you don't write ever. Write anything, even if you don't ship it, right? That's fine. I wish you would, but write anything, then make it better or do the next one in better fashion with more confidence, what have you, with a better handle on your voice, right? Solve the brilliant problem later, the brilliance problem later, because you don't have a brilliance problem. You have a momentum problem. So that's the idea of working more bravely, I think.
Yeah, it reminds me of this concept that I think Laura Klein had written about on Twitter called yacht problems. And she's like, People will worry about like, oh, will my infrastructure scale with millions of users? And it's like, sir, you haven't made a single sales call.
Right. I've heard champagne problems. Yeah, same thing. Champagne drank on the yacht, I suppose.
But I think a lot of that's fear. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say it is based on fear, which also brings us to perfectionism. That point you made earlier, because that's fear too. Right?
People are afraid of what happens if the big podcast interview says yes. Like what happens then? Like we're going to fail on the big stage. Nobody can accuse you of failing if you play it small.
That's very true as well. It's like, I need to build myself up to be worthy of doing this. I mean, we all have this. Like mine is probably pitching a brand new show, like putting together a pitch deck for a show and trying to pitch maybe a case for a show and a pilot to a network. Like that seems to be currently like the next area where I need to work more bravely. And it's not going to take me any more effort to pitch the owner of a podcast network that I know and could email, and somebody whose email I could find or Twitter handle I could find. Same amount of effort. I don't have to work harder. Same amount of smarts. I don't have to be any more clever. I just have to be a little more brave. But I do want to come back to the curiosity thing you mentioned, because I think there is a self-destructive version of curiosity where you just navel gaze too much or go down a rabbit hole too much. And it just becomes this way of sort of continually debating, oh, I'm not ready, or I have this next question. Nothing comes out the door, right? And that's a problem.
I need to learn more. I need more research.
Yeah,
I'm not ready yet.
Yeah, right. And I think like that's a result of perhaps it's a lack of focus. So for example, we talk about brand story a lot, or brand positioning, or your brand's mission or editorial mission. I think mostly what we see is these things on the homepage, the about page, all our social profiles, these things for the brand are from us to the audience. It's a way to differentiate to the audience. But what it should also be is a way to harness, both spark and harness, the team's curiosity. Because if you're really saying to the world, one of my favorite examples was a company that got acquired recently, Lessonly. They sell learning and development and training software to salespeople. Tons of competitors, like a saturated category. I think they said they have 80 domestic competitors, and they are all about, or were before they got acquired, practice. They're like, salespeople need to practice more. It's not about the gift of gab or a script. So I love this example because that's a unique point of view. Great. That's their mission. That's their premise, whatever. That should inform the team. It's not just a differentiator publicly. The team should go, well, we're all about practice. So we got to harness our curiosity and sort of put on a practice colored pair of glasses to see the world. So now anywhere we go, like to your point about going outside your echo chamber, going for a walk, reading about this, learning about this, I'm interested in comedy, whatever, you're seeing it through the lens of that premise or that mission or that change you want to spark in others. And that allows you to focus your creativity or focus your curiosity. So it's not purely like, I happen to be curious about this. It's I'm curious about this, but then I have to translate it back through that lens to make sense of it to my audience and also to myself. And so we talk about brand positioning a lot, but rarely in the context of it's supposed to focus your team. It's supposed to harness their curiosity and their productivity as well as differentiate you to the audience.
Mm-hmm. As a content marketer, I'm reading between the lines a little bit here, but I know you had talked a lot in the past about this quantity versus quality debate. And I feel like this is where you can sort of break that dichotomy and call it what it is, which is a false dichotomy. And it's like, if you're aimed in a correct direction, if we used to do deadlines, like we're like, hey, no matter what, we're going to publish 4 times a week. Like that's just what we do. I think journalists go through this, right? Like there's no writer's block, there's deadlines. And then you've got like sort of your brand mission, whatever kind of like hones that focus. And then you surprise yourself by, producing more than you would have. And sure enough, the quality is just as good, and you just amp up that pace because you sort of like have a higher standard. You have like a concrete goal that you're aiming towards. And then you can funnel all of that creativity, all of that research that you're already doing, all of that thinking you are already doing. And now it just has an outlet.
Yeah. There's no such thing as being the best. There's no such thing as shipping great work. There's just getting better every time, right? That's it. So when you bring the missing variable in this quality, quantity, stupid debate, because these are not on the same spectrum. These are different spectra. Mm-hmm. By the way, I love that word. The plural of spectrum, I recently learned, is spectra. Love that. Sounds like a superhero. So it's quality. How is it on spec? How are you measuring quality? That's the first heady debate, right? Is like, we can sense it. The audience can sense it. Is it written to spec? These specifications are met exactly. There's this metric we're looking at. What does quality even mean? Yeah, but you should sense that this is good, right? You should have taste. And you feel somehow that taste is decently met. Your vision for it is sort of met. Then there's quantity, how much of it, how often, different spectra. So like, if you have intentionality, if you are like, I'm going to do a lot of work, but also never get rid of my desire to do quality work, great. I would tell you to focus on quantity, because through the act of shipping, you get better, you find yourself, you improve, you get breakthrough ideas, all these things, you build momentum, you get to the brilliance problem because you solve the momentum problem. And then you can decide, should I scale up or down with this quantity? Because I have the ability to do so. So I would say for those who have intention to be good, to serve the audience well, to say something that actually matters to the world, chase quantity. Because naturally, the person you are showing up a lot over time, that will happen. But to the person that's lazy, the person that doesn't care about the audience, the hucksters that are like bait and switching everybody, quantity is a real problem to the audience.
Yeah.
Right. Because they don't really care about ever getting better. They don't really care about serving you. Right. I'm going to teach you to do something extraordinary despite no resources and no time. I'm going to overpromise or promise you the moon. I'm going to prey on your baser instincts all the time. And I want to amp up. So what you get are very visible people doing that. And then the methodology becomes publish something, take that something and create 20 tinier assets from that original something and put it across the internet. And what ends up happening and what people don't talk about is, sure, but if the first thing is crap, then all you're doing is taking smaller bits of crap and smearing it all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Who does that serve? Right? But if your intention is to be good, I don't know any way to do high quality work other than to do a lot of work. And eventually it's about, like, you look back, you're like, okay, I'm better. You never reach quality. You never reach great. You never reach the best. You're just like, oh, every time I did it, or over time anyway, directionally speaking, I got better. And then I have to ship something today, and I hope that persists, right? So you're never arrived. You're always arriving.
Yeah, I always think, like, the people who deal with imposter syndrome or perfectionism, they should probably just publish more, right? Like, if you care at that level, if you're nervous, if you're self-conscious, if you really care about the quality of your work, you could probably publish more. The people who don't deal with that, they don't need that advice. Like, they're going to put it out there anyway, right? It's the people who maybe like struggle with that a little bit more and just amp up the pace.
I found that a very helpful way to get over imposter syndrome is to frame the work not as what you know. You are not the expert. You are not the star. It's more what you found. Like, I'm asking this question. I went on a journey to dig up some stuff. And some of it I was shaking free from my own mind. And some of it I went out in the world and I actually found. And I'm holding up this thing and I'm like, I asked this question, or I wondered this thing, or I wanted to try and learn this. Like, the act of writing is a great way to learn, to hone your thinking. Even if you think you know something, it still has to come out of your brain into word form. And in that process, you're sharpening your own thoughts. You're trying to make sense of it. You're finding new avenues, new phrases. And so you're saying, here, I'm holding up this container and inside is this thing I found. What do you think? Right? Do you want this? And they go, no, that's not very good. What they're really saying is like, I don't like what you found. No problem. I can go find other stuff, or I can go find other people who might want this stuff. But what they're not saying is, you're not worthy. What they're not saying is, we don't like you. They may phrase it that way. You may feel it that way. But I really genuinely think that the work of a creative or a creator is to find things, to dig up insights and stories and breakthroughs and all that clarity and connection, and then hold it up to the world and be like, I found this. And I don't really care if someone says I didn't find, like, because I'm worthy to find anything. Anyone can go and dig up stuff in the closet, in the dirt. So like, it doesn't make sense that I'd feel imposter syndrome, because you're like, who am I to do this? You're just someone who went and found some stuff, right? It's not a referendum on your worthiness. That's a ridiculous thing if you frame the work as not what I know, not who I am, but what I found.
I love that. I know we're coming up on time, but I wanted to shift real quick and repurpose a Tim Ferriss question. Who comes to mind when you think of the word successful?
I don't know. It's a really weird thing. I don't really sit around thinking about success.
What does success mean to you?
What's the next project? For me, I think success means that I have had a say in how I spend my time. It's not that I control every little element of my work, but it's that I am being more proactive than reactive. And that allows me to make decisions that are aligned with my values, that allows me to self-express, that allows me to do all these other pillar pieces of the success equation for myself. But I think it's that if I look at my calendar, the bulk, if not the entirety of where I spend my time is proactively selected in my work.
You get to lay claim to your own universe, basically.
Right. It's a little bit like if you were at a corporation and people just like look at your calendar without you knowing and drop a meeting.
Hated that.
Right. That is
Absolutely
the exact
hated
opposite.
that. Yeah.
Right. So that is the exact opposite of success, where like you're being puppeteered by others with other agendas. Even if you're like, that's a friend, that's a colleague I love collaborating with them. This is a cool project. It is, life is just you're exhausting the time you have. And that's the most precious thing you have going for you.
It felt a little violating sometimes. I'm like, this is my
100%.
time. Like, you guys just take it.
One of my favorite coworkers ever would just not show up to those meetings and would not respond to Slack and would not respond to email. And I asked him once, I'm like, we're close and you don't do that for me. What's going on? Like, I'm guessing you definitely don't do it for these other coworkers that you're not close to. And he said, that's not my actual job. And if I deliver on my actual job, no one really cares if I do that stuff, or at least like my bosses don't care about that actual stuff. So whether you're independent and you have clients or an audience you're selling to, or you have a boss and peers because you're in-house, however you slice it, is that when I look at how I'm spending my time, it feels more like investing that time than spending it, than it being exhausted in ways I didn't control.
I really resonate with that. Jay, thanks so much. Where can people learn more about you? Where do you want to point them?
If you're listening to a show, it's really a quick jaunt over to Unthinkable. So that's my narrative style show. Premise is really simple. It's stories of what happens in work when we stop listening to the best practices and start trusting our intuition instead. And you find some remarkable stories. It's never really unthinkable when you hear their stories. It's only unthinkable from the outside looking in. So the show is called Unthinkable. And then jacunzo.com for all my writing, my books, my speaking, all of it. That's my home base.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is awesome.